In this week's episode of Let's Talk About It, we're going to explore power. We're going to start off in our relationship segment by just defining it. What is power? What are power imbalances? What is it all about? And then we're going to continue in our faith and context segment by exploring what exactly we should do with our power. You're here. You've joined us. Now let's talk about it.
Well, hello there.
Yo.
It's time for another episode of Let's Talk About It. I'm Malcolm Morgan.
And I'm Micah Morgan.
And we're so happy that you're joining us today. My love, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm chilling. Taking it one step at a time. How are you?
I think I might be taking it 2 steps at a time. I might be trying to jump steps.
Fancy.
I think it's important that we're honest about that.
Okay. Are you late for something?
No.
Okay.
Sometimes you just want to get there faster.
Oh, all right.
It doesn't have anything to do with being late or being early.
Well, just make sure you stretch, Don't want you to pull anything.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your concern. So we're talking about power today.
Absolutely.
We first talked about playing this episode. We were first planning it. We had a song in mind, but we ain't going to talk about that song now.
Wait, now which one? Oh.
Yeah, we're just not going to talk about it.
Well, no, I actually have a different one in mind.
Oh, what are you thinking?
Beyonce.
Oh, from the Lion King.
Yes, okay. That's my jam. Okay. I'm dancing to it right now as we speak.
I was trying to think of another power song, but I can't think of one. So
that one will do.
Yeah, we'll work with
I support that one.
It doesn't quite fit the topic that we're talking about.
I feel like we'll see. We'll check in afterward to see if it fits.
Yeah, I think we'll that will not be the soundtrack for this episode. So where are we starting today?
Man, I think a good practice is starting with defining our terms. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious, like when you think about power, what are some working definitions, phrases, just from regular life that come to mind for you?
Man, power is a loaded word.
It is.
We obviously think about like governmental power and superpowers.
Indeed. The Avengers come to mind.
But I think that power really comes down to influence. It really comes down to, that ability to influence people. I mean, when you talk about powers, a lot of times we're talking about leadership. And so people that are in leadership have the ability to influence people and push people and position people. So I think that's where I'd start with the definition of power.
Yeah, I do like your starting point of influence. And as I was kind of thinking through our preparation for this episode and just some of the kind of packaged definitions that are out there, from sociologists, influence does seem to be the common thread, right? So there's this idea that power is the capacity of people to be able to do something that they've got in mind, something that they intend, but even if there's some resistance from other folks involved. So it's really this idea that some person is able to influence some other person to do something that they otherwise probably wouldn't have done. But that there is some kind of intent, or at least a collection of preferences behind that influence. And so for me, with that kind of layered definition of kind of influence in mind, then that expands it for me, right? Now it's not just leadership and government, although I agree with you. That's a huge part of what I think about when I think about power. But I also think about relationships too, like just one-on-one with that working definition in mind. Because if you think about it, I think a lot of us, if we look back on certain relationships, have noticed that, like, man, I think I was like doing stuff that I wouldn't normally do
Yeah.
in that relationship. And sometimes that comes down to the kind of power that another person had in that relationship that we may not have even realized at that point, but they did have a series of preferences or intent that they were able to influence us to align with.
Yeah.
And we didn't even see it coming.
Yeah. I think especially when we talk about power differentials, that's something that's not always easy to see. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. You may have a power imbalance that you notice and the other person doesn't.
Very much.
But that could still manifest itself in the way that they treat you, the way they talk to you. The way they even like direct you indirect. Like maybe it's not, they're not in a supervisory role over you, but they still may be trying to influence you and point you in certain directions.
Yeah.
So power isn't always something that's so obvious and blatant. It's something that you see and be like, oh, wow. Sometimes it's, you look back and you're like, wow, I was really influenced heavily by this person.
Yeah. And didn't even realize it. Yeah. Which then naturally makes me think about how we tend to talk about manipulation. Because manipulation, I think, is also very much about influence, but it's that covert, undercover influence a lot of times that you were just talking about. But I think it's also, too, a question of when you're looking at two people, how many choices does one person tend to have at their disposal compared with the other person, right? And what impact does does one person have on the number of choices that the other person has? Like sometimes people behave in ways within a relationship where they don't realize that they're limiting the other person's choices, but they really are.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes a question of power as well, because now you are influencing that other person, not necessarily in this very overt and even like intentionally directed way, but you're influencing them by the way that you're limiting the choices that they have at their disposal.
Yeah, I think that's also a part of power. Is power having, when you're in power, you have power. You have a different set of options that are available to you, and when you are at a power deficit, you don't have those same choices.
Exactly.
You don't have those same options and opportunities. So that's a really important distinction to make there.
Yeah, and I think for me, being able to see that as an element also, I mean, it's so interesting the more we talk about this, how the definitions kind of expand and make room for more things, right? So I think another thing it makes room for is social justice, right? Because if power can be a question of how someone influences the number of choices someone else has, now you begin to ask questions about, wow, like, okay, when I go and vote and I make decisions based on what kinds of resources are available to a certain segment of a community, that then limits or opens up the kinds of choices that they have. And so now I have used my power in a way that has directly impacted, or indirectly, right? Because, I mean, you didn't go to somebody's house and say something like, oh, now you can't go to this school, or now your school doesn't have certain kinds of lunches or resources, right? You didn't directly do that, but you did use your power and influence in a way that eventually limited the choices of other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to the I guess it was 2020 election, or 2016?
It's all a blur.
It is. All of the years are starting to.
One of them.
It was the Trump election. Let's just
say what it is.
I think that's what made it, for a lot of people of color particularly, made it really painful time, because I think we all went into that election thinking, oh, this is not going to happen. Like when we actually vote, people are going to look at this and see it for what it is, and we're going to understand it is not going to happen. It just can't happen. And even as we're watching things unfold, start to happen, you just keep thinking, all right, yeah, it started out bad, but
the denial,
it's not going to happen. And so I think that power piece, that for a long time we've had that belief that eventually people's better natures will come forward and quote unquote save us from this calamity. But if you don't understand the power of your vote, what it means to be a privileged person in whatever status you have, you don't understand how your decisions affect the whole, how it affects everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about using power. I don't want to jump to that quite yet, but we do right now want to try to focus on power differentials. And so what are some common places and ways that we see power differentials come up?
Yeah. I think one common power differential or, an imbalance of power in a relationship is your, parent-child relationship, right? So the parent naturally has more influence over the choices that a child can make, over, over the resources that child has, over the experiences that child has. And a lot of that is because of parents they're responsible for the well-being of that child, right? So in that case, the power imbalance is built into the relationship based upon just the nature of the relationship itself. But then I also think about another common power imbalance is the boss and employee relationship, right? So in that sense, you have two people who have entered an agreement that one person, based on hopefully their experience and the position that they hold within an organization, that they will then have more influence over the choices and resources that you have access to.
I think there's an important distinction to make too. There's the boss employee, but there's also a boss volunteer relationship that I think is even it's a different kind of power imbalance. I think with a boss employee relationship, you have certain implied influence over that person. Things that you can ask them to do, things that are part of their job description. But with a volunteer, I think where you can really get into some dangerous territory is where you're asking them to do things, and this person obviously is a volunteer, is not being paid.
Oh, I see what you mean.
There is no compensation. You can't treat them the same, but the power imbalance is such that a volunteer maybe even be in a less of a position to say no or to push back at all, because you're like, oh, I have no status, no
stake in the organization,
right?
Yeah,
and I think you see a lot of people take advantage of that as well. Well, they're unpaid, they're here for the experience, or they're here to hopefully parlay this into a job. Oh, I might be able to get a little bit more out of them, or they might not say no to me, or they might not push back as much.
Wow. And I think you're actually hitting on something very important, because that list that you just rattled off, those are those unspoken limitations on choices, right? So what's interesting about that power imbalance between boss and volunteer is there can be some perceived limitations to choices that I think are very legitimate, right? So, for example, like you just mentioned, say the volunteer is feeling like they're being exploited, that, their time isn't being respected, their energy isn't being respected, but they're hoping that this opportunity is going to lead to a paid job in the future. Yeah. So they are perceiving their choices being limited by the potential for their boss to get upset that they advocated for themselves and then ultimately decide not to give them a job, right? And so I think that is a very important point, because as we become curious about power imbalances, it's helpful to ask, what are the perceived limitations on choices? Yeah. And perception matters, right? Because if that volunteer really does feel like they can't say no to you, that's a real barrier to them.
Absolutely.
Right? And that raises questions about how you're using your power in that relationship, how you are cultivating that emotional space with that volunteer, right? That then becomes a part of the responsibility of the boss to really be curious about and to heal some of those perceived limitations on choices.
Yeah, I know for me, being on staff at a church and having a large number of volunteers that I work with, I'm constantly mindful of that. Even if people come and they say, hey, I really want to serve, and whatever you need, I really try to look at that and temper that and be like, and be honest with them, like, hey, I really appreciate your willingness to do this. These are the limits that I'm putting in place to help you not feel like you're being taken advantage of, for you to feel like you can serve freely and serve at your best capacity. Because I've been in that position. I've been that volunteer that said, oh, I'll serve every week and I'll do multiple things. Like, I've been that person. And then I've, at the end of that, been like, man, I'm really getting run down. And so that's something that I'm trying to be cognizant of with volunteers, and not to push them too much. Still allow them to feel bought in, Still allow them to feel a part of the team. But I don't want to push that. I don't want to take advantage of that.
Yeah. And I think there's so much power, right, in giving someone the freedom to say no, and to make that explicit, right? One of the things that I get a little, what's the word? It just, it chafes against me a little bit. Is the habit of, and like I'll be honest, I've said this too, just out of habit, but the habit of saying to people who have less power or influence than you, let me know if you need anything, or, let me know XYZ. Right. Instead of making an explicit list of choices that are both in the affirmative and in the, no, what's the opposite of that? Non-affirmative. Your no choices, right? But I think there's a habit of just being like, in a lot of leadership positions, just saying, oh, well, I told them that they could come tell me. And it's like, okay, but is there a culture of the perceived choice to actually push back on leadership in your organization or your business or whatever it is? And most of the time there isn't, because in our Western culture, we have very strict kind of ideas about hierarchy and not crossing over boundaries of hierarchy. So I think it is very important as, people with power over other people to really be explicit and say, hey, if you want to say no to this, please know I'm going to respect that no. And I want you to have the freedom to say no at any time.
Yeah, that's good. And I've been in work environments and places where the unsaid thing is not agreed upon by both parties.
Oh, yikes. That's real. Yeah.
Where the leadership says, we want you guys to be open and honest, and if you have feedback that you want to give us, we want to accept that. And then you have some people that are more outspoken, and they either get ostracized or pressured, or the environment is made to the point that I don't want to be here anymore.
Exactly.
And so it's a lot of that, it's hard. This is kind of from the perspective of the person on the power deficit side of this is, okay, you say that, but what do you really mean? And what has your behavior told me is going to be the outcome of this?
Exactly. And I think that's so important too, because the history of a space also informs the kinds of choices people perceive that they have. And it's unfortunate, because I think another element of Western culture is that if we haven't written it down, then it doesn't exist. But the reality is humans are storied beings. We remember what has happened to us, and our choices are influenced by what we remember. And so if you've been in an organization for 5 years and you've seen a history of leadership retaliating non-verbally against people who have said no, right? Who have enacted their choice of no. Then you could say until you're blue in the face, we would love to hear your feedback. We would love to hear if this is not enjoyable for you. And I'm thinking like, nah, bro, like I've been here for 5 years and I've seen that that's not true.
Every person that complains disappears.
Magically. Like, where are they? So no, I'm not about to push back against, whatever initiative that you vocalize, because I already know that my choices are limited based upon our history.
Yeah. I think we've had some really high profile examples. I mean, over the last decade of these power imbalances showing up. I mean, we watched this documentary, the WeWork documentary. It's about this guy Adam Newman, who started the WeWork company. It's a co-working space, and his initial vision for this is beautiful. The work environment, people love working there. They have fun. They work hard. But as things started getting bigger and his dreams started getting bigger and his focus became so just focused on the business and not on the people, no one could tell him no. No one could push up against him. Even the people that helped start and found the company were on the outside looking in when he made decisions.
Wow.
And so we've had, I mean, this is just one of many examples, but you see how it's easy for companies and organizations to rest on the laurels of their past. Oh, look at what we've done. And then you're like, well,
I've
let's
heard that before.
look at where we are now.
Right? Like, what's happening now? That's nice.
And then it's easy when you're in a position of privilege, in a position of power, to insulate yourself and say, we got here because of my decision making, because of what I've done. So any pushback against me is an affront to the vision, to this organization. You don't believe in it becomes a us versus them mentality.
And that's so interesting too, because if we go back to kind of our original definition, right? So power is this ability to enact influence on other people based on your intent or your preferences, right? You can end up in a situation where there's almost like a hive mind at work of the organization's collective understanding of the organization's preferences and goals and vision and intent, right? And so it's interesting how with WeWork, I think it wasn't just the difficulty to push back on the leader, but there was also this like momentum of the collective imagination about the vision of the organization and the intent of the organization. And there was this feeling of, even as that continued to snowball and you could see how there was damage being caused because the vision was too hyper focused on just becoming bloated and just kind of colonizing all of every empty building ever. People didn't feel like they could like push back against that. Right. They didn't feel like they could say, hey, this feels like it's not very sustainable. This vision itself feels like it's not sustainable. So it's interesting how power can even exist, not just in behavioral relations, but even in like the imagination of a group of people.
Yeah. And momentum is a real thing. I think that's, I think this is something that you alluded to. When things get rolling in a certain direction, it takes more than just one person saying stop.
It's real.
To stop it. Yep. Especially when the whole organization, everything, the focus, the money, everything is pushing in one direction. It's really difficult for one voice, especially a power deficit voice, to speak up and say, hey guys, wait. Because then you look like the outlier. You look like the person who's stopping progress. You do. And I think that's a good sign to know that that your power is not being used in a healthy way is if it becomes you're against us. Yeah. The focus isn't, all right, what are you saying? Let's analyze this and let's internalize this and figure out what we can do to not only help you feel better and feel heard, but how can we improve the organization? But when it becomes, well, you're against us. You're against progress. What's wrong with you? It's a red flag. Yeah.
But what's so interesting, though, I appreciate you bringing that up, because what tends to happen is, even though the people with the power deficit are the ones that tend to notice when power is being unhealthily used or when there's something unsustainable about an organization, there does tend to be that pushback, right? The perception that those people are like the villains or the squeaky wheels. But if you think about it, the folks with the power deficit tend to have the better pulse on, the health of an organization, because the folks with the most power tend to be more blinded, right? Like they're more biased. The stakes are higher for them in terms of if that vision doesn't work out. And so I think there's room for us to commit to being curious, at least, right? Sometimes squeaky wheels are going to be actual squeaky wheels. They just want to feel powerful by being destructive. Sometimes that does happen. But for the most part, people with the power differential are raising some really valid claims. And, you want to have a space where those people feel like they can actually say, hey, I think we need to take a closer look at this.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say to a person that is, well, let me back up a little bit before we kind of pivot to the next part. We talked about a few of the difficulties you can have in a power deficit relationship, but there's also a relational aspect that we haven't really talked about at all. Something that we've experienced being in leadership, particularly on the church side for a while, is that it can be really hard to form peer relationships if even in your church environment, people consider you over them or above them in some way. So there is the power differential, obviously, in that other direction of, okay, I don't feel like I can come to you. I don't feel like I can give you critique. But there's also the side of it where people don't really get close to you because they feel like you're almost untouchable.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think, for what it's worth, if we go back to this idea that there is this kind of collective imagination about what power is and how it tends to be used at work in our culture, I think some of what's happening there is there has historically been a pattern of folks with more power kind of abusing their power, right? And using their influence to make choices that limit the choices of other folks. And so when you have someone looking at another person with more, power than them in a church or whatever organization, I think there's legitimate reason for them to be a little skeptical, a little self-protective, a little bit less willing to get emotionally close.
Yeah.
And I grieve that, right? Because I'm like, certainly I don't think everyone wants to abuse their power. And I know for myself, I want to be a person that that multiplies power and doesn't abuse it, right? But I have to be honest and accept that when people, see me or any other person in leadership, that history, that kind of historical definition of how power has been used is operating in their mind, probably.
Yeah. I think what's the word? I don't want to say bothers, but what saddens me, I think, is that just the presence of a power imbalance can make people feel like you're inaccessible.
Yeah.
Or that they feel like they have to be at a certain place to even, like, let me get myself together and then maybe we could be friends type of thing, And it's unfortunate because I think we both strive to be people who are open, honest, and don't, we're in an informal setting. We kicking it. We just kicking it, especially people in our own age group. People have common interests. We just want to talk, and I think people that know us know that. But I know it's not an easy switch to flip and just be like, oh,
it's not. It's not.
Because who wants to go to who wants to go to a party with their boss? Like, oh gosh, like.
And that's what it is too, right? I think that's, as funny as that analogy is, but with a power imbalance comes certain responsibilities, certain commitments to professionalism and ethics that can, if you have a more informal relationship with someone than you should, those things can be put at risk, right? And so the reason that the boss is a stuffy presence at a party, in this analogy, is because they can't forsake the ethics and the responsibility and the commitments to professionalism. I mean, they can, but they shouldn't.
They shouldn't.
Right? And so they suck up all the air in the room because they're trying to maintain the boundaries that are required of that power imbalance. But then the other people feel like they're suffocated and like they can't really have fun, right? So there's a lot of elements at play. Yeah. And I agree. It makes me sad too, because then on the flip side of that, right, what tends to happen is people who have a lot of power and have a lot of, how do I want to say this? People who have a lot of power and also have limited, like, peer relationships. They tend to have limited access to a lot of emotional intimacy, right? Because they don't have a lot of relationships where they can kind of let their hair down, be unprofessional, be their unpolished self. And so it's sad on both sides, right? It's sad because you have people with a power deficit who feel like they can't be themselves. or can't get close to people with power. And then on the flip side, you have people with a lot of power who don't have a lot of opportunities to grow emotionally healthy, because they don't have a lot of peer relationships. So
I mean, power in isolation becomes scary and really easily rolls into abuse of that power. It's really, power without accountability. And if you don't have a real system for accountability, you will end up everything, any critique, any questioning is opposition and must be gotten rid of.
Legit though, right? And so if we go back to our definition, right? Like if power is the ability to enact influence on other people, even in spite of resistance, then being able to develop a healthy style of power is being practiced in receiving resistance. And so being practiced at bending to the resistance of others, allowing other people the opportunity to say no to you, actually helps you to become someone who can steward your power without abusing it.
Absolutely.
But if you're someone who just has gone through life without hearing a no for 23 years,
oh my gosh,
or without experiencing the feelings that come with resistance for 23 years, then yeah, like unfortunately the trajectory is leading you toward an abuse of your influence, because you don't know what that feels like to hear no from somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, you look at any documentary or anything you watch about dictators, first thing they do, get rid of dissent.
Yikes.
How do we do that? Usually ends up with some murders and with some taking of financial resources. You just start getting rid of dissent and consolidating your power.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And so when we get into isolation, we get into these spaces where no one can tell us anything, where we don't have the proper relationships around us to ground us, it can be a very dangerous place. And when we're on that road, we might not have a country to be a dictator over, but we may have a group of people, a department, a company, a community that we're being dictators of.
Yikes. Man, I'm trying not to I know we're getting over time, but one thing that's coming to mind too is just the psychology of power, right? So if you're someone who has gotten used to having a lot of power, once you begin to experience its deterioration for whatever reason, there can really be a feeling of legitimate fear.
Yeah.
And sometimes even paranoia.
Yeah.
And so again, if you're not someone who is practiced at feeling the feelings of there's someone else's influence that can trump mine, then sometimes people can really spiral into this self-protective, paranoid, tirade.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, goodness, I'm trying to think of examples of, but I think dictators are prime examples of that, right? Because the paranoia that we see in a lot of, historical examples of dictatorships, it's really capturing that dynamic, right? They start feeling the deterioration of their power, and the fear that they feel motivates them to just irrational behaviors.
Yeah. So we're going to start to pivot. We're still staying on the topic of power, but we're going to start to focus a little bit more in a faith community.
Yeah.
What do we do with power in our faith community? So we looked at power kind of generally. So what does power look like within our faith communities?
I think what's really important in answering this question is remembering what God intended for humans in general. So, I mean, I will, until I'm blue in the face, go back to the Genesis creation story, because I mean, that was God's ideal. That was God's ideal imagination for creation. And when I go back there and I see the way that God stamped upon us God's image, right? Like humankind was created in God's image. That was truly, I mean, theologians have said a lot about what that means, but at its core was this trust in a form of ambassadorship over creation, and this trust to take care of and protect creation on earth, with God's will dictating how we make those choices, right? And so ultimately then the question, how do we use our power, is that, right? It's to continue participating in that ambassadorship, right? Being appointed officials, over creation. and not in a domineering, kind of destructive way, but in a way that the symbolism of the garden really embodies, right? Like you don't go into a garden and trample over all the flowers and not water it and, pull up the flowers instead of the weeds, right? You go into a garden and you nurture it, you cultivate it so that it produces more life.
Yeah.
And so that is what we're supposed to do with our power.
I think power has to be something that we understand to be shared and not limited. We talked about it in the dictator example of, I'm losing this power. But when you look at the creation story, God gave Adam and Eve power and authority over and dominion over the land, naming the animals and tending to the land, taking care of the animals, and that did not make God any less God.
No, come on now.
And so it's important for us as leaders to be able to look and see me empowering other people, me giving power, whatever, however you want to use it, power and authority to people. Does it make me any less whatever I am?
But that's what Western culture
absolutely
tells you happens, right?
Yeah.
So, it's so interesting to see the contrast between God's imagination for how power should be used in the creation story, the contrast between that and the way that, human culture tends to interpret power.
Yeah.
Humans say that power is limited.
Yeah.
It's a finite resource. But when you look at the creation story, God not only gave humans the ability to steward and have influence over creation, but if you look at, for example, when God created the vegetation, the creation story says that God gave the trees and the vegetation the ability to make more of their own kind.
Yeah.
Right. So God wasn't just multiplying power just to humans.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like God was giving creation itself the ability to multiply. And for me, that's just so beautiful because it could have been so much more efficient for God to just decide exactly the point in time that each thing was created.
Yep.
But for God to trust both humans and creation itself with influence over creation, that's just amazing.
I think that efficiency point is a great point. It's real easy when there's one person that makes all the decisions. You know who to blame, and then
right.
ultimately you know who you need to go to get the answers you want. And as a leader, I don't have to answer to anybody. Just make the decision. But this is why monarchies fell apart.
There you go.
Because when it was down to one person, you were up to the whims of that one person.
Because nobody's meant to have all that power, right? We think it's efficient, but it's not sustainable.
That's it. We think it's sufficient, but it's not sustainable. That's a quote.
Maybe. We'll see.
That's a quote.
Put it on a T-shirt.
So yeah, I think one of the ways that we could see how power is abused is that when power is seen as a limited resource, people that are coming into your space that may, I don't even want to say challenge, but be in your mind, if you're viewing power as a limited resource, be a threat to your power. That's a good sign that power is being abused. When new people are not seen as a part of the community or are not a part of the leadership or a part of the team, but you're kind of like, what are you doing? Why are you here?
Yeah, that's legit. And I just, I want to play the other side of the argument. There are many situations where people do come in and they do try to usurp and they try to enact influence over other people before they've developed the trust that would warrant that. Yeah. And so, what I want to also honor is that sharing power comes with risk.
Yes.
And we see that in the creation story as well, right? God trusted us with the power to steward creation and we ruined it. Right? But that is always going to be an inherent risk. Like if you want to have influence over a space that is sustainable, you're going to have to take on the risk that comes with multiplying that influence. If you don't want it to be sustainable and you want it to be efficient, go ahead and hoard it. Right? I mean, you will probably implode in 2 years. But hey, it's efficient. Things run like clockwork. You know what decisions are being made and why. Okay.
are you willing to sacrifice some short-term progress for the long-term health?
That's good. Yeah. That's the question.
That's what it is. I mean, you may give somebody the authority to be over the website, and they may make a mistake and have a typo on the website that you wouldn't have made.
Yeah.
But that person's going to learn that lesson. And then a year from now, when that person is more confident, more in tune with the way the organization works, it's going to be the work will be spread out better. You'll have people that are empowered to do what they need to do and not always looking over their shoulder or waiting for somebody else to make the decision. So are you willing to give up a little bit of that power for the long-term health of your community?
That's the question. And what's interesting too is where you have a multiplication of power, you have a multiplication of choice, which means you also have more opportunity for innovation and creativity, right? Yeah. So in this example with, the person that you trusted to work on the website, now that they are in a position where you've given them some influence, you've given them a set of choices that they can make, they learn from this mistake, and now there's a new set of choices that they're going to make in the future, right? So that's innovation and that's creativity at work. Yeah. But if you only have one person that's able to enact their influence and preferences, that we don't have an infinite capacity for imagination and choice. We just simply don't. And so if you have more than one person, that's more, more opportunity for creativity. And I think, especially in the church space, we were just talking, a couple episodes ago about church innovation. And you want to be a space that's able to move with the times and, of course, keep the message the same, but allow the method to become more fruitful for the people that you're trying to serve. Yeah. But if you've only got two people that are able to make choices, not a whole lot of creativity can happen there.
Yeah. So we're getting ready to wrap up this episode, but before we leave, I definitely want to talk about the right ways to use power. And I think something that we haven't really touched on that I want to make sure we do talk about is that as leaders, we have to use our power to protect those that are vulnerable.
Yes.
It's essentially important. I've been in places where I didn't feel protected by leaders. And so as leaders, we have to be able to identify those people that maybe don't have as much confidence, that maybe aren't even as skilled or as talented as other people, and protect them and guide them and encourage them, put them in the best positions possible to be successful.
That's good.
And when you see either people or things that are coming their way that may be detrimental or damaging to them, do everything that you can to keep those things from happening, keeping those people away from them, keeping those conversations away from them. I know a lot of my job as a leader is to deflect a lot of the bad stuff, filter it out, and turn it from criticism into critique.
That's good. Yeah.
Into constructive critique. And so as leaders, we have to be prepared to do that with the power and influence that we have.
Absolutely. And I think that's coming right out of Psalm 23, right? Your rod and your staff, they protect and guide me, right? Yeah. And that's the picture of leadership that we should have, right? That you're both protecting and guiding. I think another way that our power should be used is to also, make sure that it's not hoarded, right? So I think we've been talking about this the whole episode, but I'll just briefly bring up one of my favorite scriptures is Philippians 2. 1-8, where it's inviting us to have this mindset that Christ have, where Christ didn't see equality with God as something to hoard, something to, use to his own advantage, but he served, right? He emptied himself even up to the point of death. And so really thinking about power as something that shouldn't be just craved for the sake of having it. Yeah. But that it really is something that's supposed to be a tool for serving.
Yeah. And we talked about this a little bit already, but I think that empowering people and multiplying power point that you brought up earlier is an important aspect of what we should do as leaders in faith communities. Like you said, it's easier, it's more efficient for just one person to just wield the mighty sword of church power. But it's way more beneficial to the community. I mean, that's what church and faith community are about. It's about building community and not building one person or one person's ego and one person's authority. It's about making sure that everybody feels bought into the community and also has the ability to make decisions, has agency. Agency to me is a huge word when I'm in conversation with other leaders is, do your people have agency? Are you giving people agency in the spaces that they're in? And so that's important as we're thinking about empowering people and multiplying power.
Very. I think that's it.
So this episode was all about power. We started out talking about power differentials, some of the pitfalls of power differentials, how it can affect workplaces, how it can affect relationships, and the ways that we can identify and as leaders, things that we can do to be better stewards of our leadership. And then we focused in on the faith community. And we talked about how we can use power. How is power used in our communities? And then how are we able to not abuse our power and use our power for the betterment and the growth of the individuals in our community, whether they be volunteers, staff, or just members, and for multiplying power within our faith communities. But this is not the end of the conversation, people.
No, it's not.
We want this conversation to continue in your small groups, in your dorm rooms, in your homes, and we'd love to hear about it. So you can use the hashtag talk about it POD. Let us know your thoughts about power. What experiences have you had? How have you seen power used in your faith communities? And maybe even you have some tips for some of our listeners for how to approach power differentials. We'd love to hear about it. You can also connect with us on social media. Micah, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at JMarieMorgan. And where can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Malcolm DOT Media. That's at Malcolm DOT Media on Instagram and Twitter. Is that it?
I think that's it. We did a thing.
You guys, we really hope this episode helped you. We hope to hear from you guys. Thank you guys for listening. I'm Malcolm Morgan.
And I'm Micah Morgan.
This has been Let's Talk About It. We'll see you all next time.